Well, as you can see, we've asked MJ to come back in the studio to answer just a couple of hard-hitting questions. Last time we talked about sexual trauma and how to help each other feel safe when they're dealing with physical intimacy. Today, I want to throw a couple of hard questions at you that I get all the time. I would say at least 40 to 50% of all couples who are trying to navigate the recovery process, they kind of hit this moment. At least the betrayed spouse hits this moment. The question, the moment, the difficulty is, my unfaithful spouse is just not doing what I want them to do. I'm doing my work, or maybe the betrayed is not doing any work, but they so desperately hear that the unfaithful should be doing these things, yes, and they're not. Yeah. And the temptation is for the betrayed spouse to kind of micromanage or babysit or mother the unfaithful spouse into, doing all this stuff to help them feel safe. I have to imagine that in your caseload and all the people that flood your office, that you have to see that pretty frequently.
Yes. I look at it, you use the word safety, and that's really what is happening there. When there's been infidelity, the world becomes unsafe, right? The person I am with, my person who has my back, has now betrayed me. Now, it's not safe with this person and the world feels unsafe. So betrayed people will often do many safety-seeking behaviors. There's a mindset, I liked how you said, there's this kind of expectation or there are things that people can do in recovery to heal, right? Sometimes people are recommended go to therapy, go to 12-step groups, go to conferences or do intensives. Working the 12 steps is something that I hear frequently and that works for many people is quite healing. I also see betrayed partners who are very aware of the healing opportunities after betrayal. And so they'll say, okay, my person betrayed me. I want them to do all the things to help them heal. So I want them to go to group, go to 12-step, go to therapy, read the books, listen to the podcast, do all these things. Why? So that I can feel safe. Now, what that actually means is, if the unfaithful person does these things, I think the way it lands on a betrayed spouse is, if my unfaithful partner understands him or herself, if they understand what their thoughts are, what their feelings are, and why they chose certain behaviors, that gives them more choice in their behaviors moving forward. So if we know what we're thinking, we know what we're feeling, then we can say, then I choose to behave this way. Betrayed partners often want the unfaithful to have insight, to have understanding. What makes you tick the way you do? What makes you think the way you do? What makes you behave the way you do? If you know what you're doing and you know who and how you are, then you have more control to not betray me again.
So if I understand what you're saying, we unfaithfuls, we think, oh my gosh, you're babysitting, micromanaging, just leave me alone. But actually, the betrayed is trying to seek for safety. They're constantly looking for ways to feel safe. And so as the unfaithful is doing recovery work, it's actually making the betrayed feel safer. Is that right?
I think that's such an important point to highlight. A betrayed spouse will look at the unfaithful partner and say, what are you doing to create insight? What are you doing to learn about yourself? Right? That's the purpose of the therapy and some of the group work and the intensives and the podcasts and the books. It's so that the unfaithful will understand what their thoughts are, what their feelings are, and so they can then choose behavior instead of being reactive and doing behavior without really thinking about it. And so a betrayed spouse will micromanage, will say, are you doing this? Are you doing that? Because if you aren't, then I worry you're going to betray me again because you don't get it or you don't understand what's driving you. So for the unfaithful spouse, they might feel mothered or picked on or micromanaged. But if they can hold on to the fact that my betrayed partner is micromanaging me because they want safety and they want me to show I understand myself so that I'm not going to betray them again. That's really what's going on there.
And one of the best things that we could do is kind of humble ourselves and pick up a book, go to a meeting, do something, even if we feel like we're safe, right? And we genuinely don't have any urges to act out. Sometimes it's kind of like, look, if you'll just put some added extra effort into it, your betrayed partner or spouse will probably feel a little bit safer. What does the betrayed spouse do when the unfaithful refuses to do recovery work? They won't go to an intensive. They won't go to therapy. They won't take action. Maybe they're just, get over it, move on. I don't want to keep talking about it. I've done this work. It's time for you to do some work. I mean, what is the betrayed spouse? How can they self-soothe, heal? How do they navigate through that complex situation?
There are some layers to how to handle that. The basic layer is, I call it going sensory. Might have talked about this in a previous video, right? Going sensory means when we are in distress, at a very basic level, we need to care for our nervous system and care for our bodies. And the way we do that is through the senses. So tactile. A way to soothe our nervous system is to touch something that feels good, like maybe a material that feels soft or comfortable, right? A touch. Olfactory, to have some nice smelling candles or incense, whatever the smelly lotion is that smells good. Auditory, we listen to things that are soothing, right? Taste, sometimes food can be comforting. So we go sensory and we care for our bodies. When we are in relationship with someone who is not willing to do their healing work, our nervous system is going to be activated. And so in those moments of big distress, that's where my brain says, all right, go sensory, do this very basic care to give yourself some soothing. But the next step is, okay, let's imagine I have listened to great music and lit some candles. Now what? This is where the grieving comes in, right? Grieving. So there are stages of grieving, these tasks we do in grieving. Right? When somebody grieves, when they have a loss, and in this case, we're talking about the loss of control, safety. My person refuses to do recovery work or doesn't understand what needs to be done. I don't have very much control over that person. So what do I do? In that place, we might go into denial for a little while. I don't know what to do, la, 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 la.
Right.
We might get really angry. I'm mad that this person is not doing what they need to do. We might do some bargaining. If you would just do what you need to do, then we would be okay. Please do your recovery work so we can be okay. Sadness, they can sink into some degrees of depression. I feel hopeless and helpless. I don't know how to make this happen. And sadness is a normal, natural response to that until we get to these moments of acceptance. We can influence someone, but we don't have control over them. And so if we're in relationship with someone who isn't doing their work for whatever reason, they're not ready, they're scared, they have a lot of shame, the list of reasons, the betrayed partner has to soothe themselves and do some of this grieving because there are losses, loss of control, loss of safety, loss of peace, loss of connection. And so that's where we need to be in relationship with safe, healthy people who can take us through the grief process to get to moments of acceptance. Now let's talk about the next layer. There's also boundary setting. So there's self-soothing through the sensory, going sensory. There's grieving because there's such loss. And then there are setting boundaries. We don't have to tolerate certain behaviors. We can set a boundary and say, I can't tolerate this. Sometimes that looks like if you're going to choose not to be in recovery, then I have to choose what to do. I may or may not stay in this relationship. I may choose to not talk for a while I self-soothe until I can come back and talk with you again. I'm not advocating breaking up or divorce.
Sure.
But I am advocating we have to figure out where our limits are and verbalize those to people to say, this is what what I'm for and what I will tolerate and what I stand up and advocate for. But these other behaviors, if they're too painful and hurtful, we don't have to sit around and just take that. We can make choices about how to protect ourselves.
So another tough question is, for the betrayed that needs to set those boundaries and maybe draw some lines in the sand or even just stand up for themselves, A lot of betrayeds, and really male and female, feel like they can't do that. They feel like they don't want to, they can't, and it's a really complex struggle for them. Take a couple of moments and maybe speak to why a betrayed may feel like they can't draw those boundaries and uphold them.
The first thing that comes to mind is a list of fears. And I'm thinking about boundaries in general. Why do people not set boundaries? Why do they have interactions with someone else that aren't working for them, but they don't say anything? And they tolerate poor or unhealthy, or really, they tolerate intolerable behavior. Why don't people set boundaries? It's often tied to fear, the list of fears, such as, if I set this boundary, I will lose relationship. If I set this boundary, I'm afraid they won't like me. I'm afraid I will lose love. I'm afraid if I set this boundary, they won't respect it. And then what do I do? And so often not setting boundaries is fueled by some fears, fear or fears. People often have a short list.
So if that's the case, what do they do, right? How do they calm their fears? How do they care for their fear that they're experiencing in that situation?
The answer, I think, lies in relationship. We humans, we experience fear. What do we do in that scared place? Sometimes people, when they are afraid, will isolate, they'll pull back, right? They self-protect. The healing comes when we are in relationship. And so if a betrayed partner is trying to set boundaries with an unfaithful spouse, and is really afraid, if I say, I will not tolerate this, I'm not okay with this behavior, and they get hit with, oh no, if I say that, will he leave me? Will he or she get mad at me? Will they not talk to me? Will they punish me? I'm so scared of the consequences. A way to manage that is to talk about the fears with a safe, trustworthy person who can hold the space to pull apart the fears. Some of them are irrational. Some of them are founded, they're valid.
Absolutely.
And so we need somebody to be with us to try to figure out, are we responding and not setting boundaries because of irrational fear? Are we afraid of setting boundaries because there really is a potential consequence? And then pulling through, can I tolerate the idea that that might happen? Can I tolerate if that actually does happen? What would I do? We need somebody to be with us to figure out that part of this.
So for the betrayed who hears that and goes, yeah, I am afraid, it is possible for them to stand up for themselves and eventually get to a point, right, where they can draw a boundary and enforce it. Because I think some of them wonder that they're ever going to get there. Meanwhile, the unfaithful is acting out, doing all the stuff that they're doing, engaging in destructive behavior. But it is possible to get there, right?
And remember, we heal in relationship and we set boundaries in relationship. So this is where groups come in. Having a support group can be very helpful, like a Harboring Hope, a group where we can talk about the difficulties of setting boundaries and be supported by other people who can help us figure out what boundaries do we actually want to set, what are some we're not ready to set, what are some we're going to set at a later date, to help us figure out, okay, what's getting in the way of us setting boundaries. In a human condition, this happens quite frequently. People sometimes get to the place where they're ready, they can set the boundary, and then immediately following the boundary setting, they have doubt, they feel guilty, maybe I did something wrong, oh, maybe I shouldn't have set that boundary. And that's where the relationships, the safe people can hold us and say, you set the boundary for safety. It's okay to set the boundary. Let me help you maintain it and enforce it. I've got your back, right? To stay strong, to keep this boundary in place. You did a good thing. We need people to kind of prop us up on each side to help us move forward. And I think that's just such a vital part of maintaining and keeping these boundaries.
I know you didn't mean to, but that actually really sets the stage for any of you that need to get into a group. I didn't plan on doing this, but I can't say enough about either harboring hope for the betrayed spouse or hope for healing for the unfaithful spouse. Because when you're in community, number one, you don't feel so alone. Number two, you don't feel like you're the only one that is dealing with this. And number three, you're with safe people utilizing an expert curriculum that can help you make it another day, another week, another month, and before you know it, you wake up and you go, man, I'm doing better than I ever thought I could have done. So thanks for coming in again.
Thank you for having me.